To understand the gravity of the events that unfolded in November 1998, one must first understand the stage upon which they were set. Lakewood, a suburb of Jacksonville, Florida, was not a place where people expected to find police tape or news vans. It was a community defined by its stability, a middle-class enclave of single-story brick and stucco homes shaded by the sprawling canopies of ancient live oaks. Spanish moss draped from the branches, filtering the Florida sunlight into a soft, dappled glow that lay across manicured lawns and paved driveways. It was the quintessential American backdrop, a neighborhood where the concept of the stranger was abstract and distant. Residents knew the cars parked in every driveway. They knew the schedules of the mail carriers and the names of the dogs that barked behind chain-link fences. It was a place where locking the front door during the day felt like an unnecessary paranoia, a violation of the unspoken pact of safety that bound the streets together. In the late 90s, the digital age had not yet severed the physical connections of neighborhood life. Children played outside until the streetlights hummed to life. Bicycles lay abandoned in front yards, and the sound of screen doors slamming was the metronome of the afternoon. Dodge Road, in particular, was a quiet artery in this system. It was a street where families settled and stayed, creating a multi-generational familiarity that reinforced the feeling of security. The houses sat relatively close together, separated only by narrow strips of grass and modest hedges, creating an architectural intimacy that forced neighbors into each other's lives. Privacy existed, but isolation did not. At the heart of this community lived the Clifton family. Steve and Sheila Clifton had built a life that embodied the aspirations of Lakewood. They were a family grounded in routine and affection, deeply integrated into the fabric of the neighborhood. Steve worked hard, a dedicated father who found his joy in the simple rhythms of family life and the game of golf. Sheila was the anchor, a mother whose world revolved around the well-being of her children. They had 2 daughters, Jessica and Maddie, and the dynamic within the home was one of close-knit warmth. The age gap between the sisters placed them in different stages of youth, but it did not diminish the bond they shared. Jessica was older, navigating the complexities of adolescence, while Maddie, at 8 years old, was the vibrant, undeniable center of the household's energy. Maddie Clifton was not merely a child living on Dodge Road, she was a presence. Neighbors described her as having a magnetic quality, a bubbling effervescence that made her impossible to ignore. She was a tomboy with a ribbon in her hair, a girl who could keep pace with the neighborhood boys in a game of kickball and then sit patiently for piano lessons. She was athletic, taking after her father with a burgeoning talent for golf, a sport that requires patience and precision, traits she balanced with an 8-year-old's boundless enthusiasm. To the residents of Lakewood, Maddie was a fixture. She was the child who waved at passing cars, who knew which neighbors would offer a cookie, and who fearlessly traversed the yards that connected the homes. The Clifton house was a sanctuary for Maddie, but her territory extended to the pavement and the lawns of the adjacent houses. She was trusting. This trust was not a flaw of character but a reflection of her environment. She had been raised in a world that had given her no reason to fear. The concept of a predator was a fairy tale monster, not a reality that lived across the street. In the Clifton family dynamic, Maddie was the baby, cherished and protected, yet given the freedom appropriate for a child in a safe neighborhood. Steve and Sheila were attentive parents, the kind who knew where their children were, but they also subscribed to the prevailing wisdom of the time and place. The neighborhood watched out for its own. The 3rd of November 1998 began like any other Tuesday in Jacksonville. The humidity had broken slightly with the arrival of autumn, though in Florida, the season was more of a suggestion than a distinct climatic shift. The air was crisp enough to encourage outdoor play. The political atmosphere in the state was buzzing with Election Day activities, but for an 8-year-old, the machinations of government were irrelevant. For Maddie, the day was defined by the school bell and the promise of the afternoon. When she arrived home from school, the routine was established. The Cliftons operated on a schedule that allowed for the chaotic joy of childhood within structured boundaries. Maddie's world was small, geographically speaking. It consisted of her home, her school, and the immediate radius of Dodge Road. This smallness was her shield. It was assumed that within this perimeter, the variables were controlled. She changed out of her school clothes, ready to maximize the remaining daylight. Her energy was high. She was looking for playmates, for engagement. The relationship between the Cliftons and their neighbors was typical for Lakewood. They exchanged pleasantries, borrowed tools, and kept a benevolent eye on each other's property. Directly across the street from the Clifton residence stood the home of the Phillips family. The physical distance between the two front doors was negligible, perhaps 50 feet of asphalt and grass. The Phillips family, much like the Cliftons, were part of the scenery. They had a son, Joshua, who was 14. To the adults of the neighborhood, Joshua was just another teenager, perhaps a bit quiet, but unremarkable in the way that makes a person blend seamlessly into the background of suburbia. He was not a stranger. He was a known quantity, a boy who had grown up alongside the other children of Dodge Road. In the Clifton household, the dynamic on that Tuesday afternoon was peaceful. Sheila was home, attending to the domestic rhythms of the day. Steve was not yet back from work. The house was filled with the mundane, comforting noises of daily life. Maddie asked to go outside to play. It was a request that required no deliberation. The sun was still up, the street was quiet, and her friends were likely emerging from their own homes. Sheila granted permission, a decision made thousands of times by thousands of mothers in Lakewood without consequence. Maddie stepped out the front door into the late afternoon light. She was wearing a t-shirt, shorts, and socks dressed for activity. She did not have a specific destination, just the general intent to find a game, to find a friend. She was a social creature, driven by the need for interaction. She wandered into the yard, perhaps looking toward the houses where her friends lived. The street was largely empty, the lull before the 5 p.m. rush of returning commuters. The tragedy of the Clifton family dynamic is found in this specific moment of normalcy. There was no premonition, no sudden drop in temperature, no ominous silence that warned of danger. The threat did not come from a white van prowling the neighborhood or a stranger lurking in the bushes. The threat was embedded in the environment itself, camouflaged by familiarity. Maddie's trust in her world was absolute. She saw the house across the street not as a fortress of danger, but as the home of a neighbor, a boy she knew, a place as safe as her own living room. As the minutes ticked by, the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the lawns of Dodge Road. Inside the Clifton house, the clock moved toward the time when Maddie would be expected back for dinner. The buffer between a normal Tuesday and a nightmare is often measured in minutes. For Sheila Clifton, those minutes were passing without alarm. She assumed Maddie was nearby, perhaps in a backyard, or just out of sight, engaged in the timeless business of being 8 years old. The psychological landscape of the family was calm. They were secure in their home, secure in their community, and secure in the belief that the rules of their world were immutable. Children play, neighbors watch, and everyone comes home when the streetlights come on. This sense of security was the foundation of Lakewood. It was what sold houses and kept families rooted there for decades. It was a collective belief system that shielded the residents from the harsh realities of the wider world. But on that afternoon, just yards away from where Sheila Clifton stood in her kitchen, that belief system was being dismantled. The quiet streets, usually a source of comfort, were acting as a veil. The architecture of the neighborhood, with its close-set houses and thick vegetation, provided privacy, but it also provided cover. The Clifton family was standing on a precipice. The dynamic of love, trust, and routine that they had carefully cultivated was about to be shattered by an act of violence, so incongruous with their setting that it would take days for the mind to even comprehend it as a possibility. Maddie was just outside. She was right there. The proximity was the most haunting element. She hadn't wandered off into the woods, she hadn't been snatched from a bus stop miles away. She was in the heart of her safety zone. The introduction to this crime is not a story of a child lost in the unknown, but of a child lost in the most familiar place on earth. The quiet streets of Lakewood held their breath, masking the horror that had already begun to unfold behind the closed doors of a neighbor's house, while the sun continued to shine on the empty swing sets and the manicured lawns of Dodge Road. To the residents of Lakewood, Joshua Phillips was not a bogeyman in the shadows. He was the boy next door. He was a fixture in the neighborhood, a figure so ordinary he rendered himself effectively invisible. At 14 years old, he was navigating the awkward transition from childhood to adolescence with no apparent friction. There were no glaring red flags in his school records, no documented history of animal cruelty, and no outbursts of public violence that would have drawn the wary eyes of neighborhood parents. He was, by all distinct measures, a quiet teenager living in a beige house directly across the street from the Cliftons. His existence was defined by a rigid domestic structure enforced by his father, Steve Phillips. The Phillips household was governed by strict rules, and Joshua had learned to operate within them with a compliant, almost fearful obedience. Those who knew the family later testified to the intensity of Steve's parenting style, noting that Joshua appeared terrified of his father's temper and the potential for discipline. This fear would later be cited as the primary catalyst for the tragedy, the psychological pivot point where a panic over an accidental injury spiraled into a calculated homicide. In Joshua's mind, the consequences of breaking a rule or causing an accident were seemingly worse than the reality of a dying child. This conditioning created a barrier between Joshua and the moral gravity of his actions, allowing him to compartmentalize the events of November 3rd with chilling efficiency. In the days following Maddie's disappearance, the community mobilized in a way that usually unearths secrets. Police officers, FBI agents, and hundreds of volunteers combed the grid of streets, searching backyards, dumpsters, and wooded areas. Through it all, Joshua Phillips remained in the epicenter, not as a suspect, but as a spectator. He did not flee. He did not break down. He continued his daily routine with a steadiness that baffled investigators in hindsight. He attended school, completed his homework, and ate meals with his parents. He watched television in his room, sitting on the very bed that concealed the object of the entire city's desperate search. His interactions with law enforcement during this week were composed and helpful. When detectives canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors to build a timeline of Maddie's last known movements, Joshua was cooperative. He told them he had seen Maddie that afternoon. He pointed them away from his home, suggesting she had walked off toward a friend's house or down the street. He played the role of the helpful witness, providing false leads with a demeanor that police later described as entirely unbothered. There was no shaking of the hands, no cracking of the voice, no sweat on the brow. He possessed a flat affect that read as teenage apathy rather than sociopathic detachment. To the adults around him, he was just a kid who didn't know anything, perhaps slightly bored by the intrusion of the police. The interior of the Phillips home, specifically Joshua's bedroom, became a macabre theater of concealment. The room was typical for a boy his age, cluttered with the artifacts of adolescence, yet it held a secret that required constant, active maintenance. The waterbed, a popular furnishing of the era, sat on a wooden pedestal base. It was inside this hollow base, beneath the heavy, water-filled mattress, that he had stowed Maddie's body. The logistics of this concealment required a disturbing level of physical and mental fortitude. He had to lift the mattress, deposit the victim, and then live atop the result. For 7 nights, Joshua Phillips slept inches above the girl he had killed. The psychological implication of this proximity is difficult to overstate. Most killers distance themselves from the body, driven by guilt, fear of discovery, or revulsion. Joshua closed the distance. He inhabited the same space, breathing the air that slowly began to carry the scent of decomposition. To mask the reality of what was happening beneath him, he burned incense and used deodorizers, explaining away the smell to his mother as the result of teenage hygiene issues or household pets. When the odor became undeniable, he blamed the family dog. This ability to rationalize and deflect while living in the immediate physical presence of his victim demonstrated a compartmentalization capability far beyond his 14 years. Outside his window, the search for Maddie Clifton was reaching a fever pitch. Sheila and Steve Clifton, Maddie's parents, were living a nightmare on national television, pleading for the return of their daughter. Joshua saw this. He watched the news coverage that broadcast the pain he had caused. He saw the yellow ribbons tied around trees and the flyers pasted on telephone poles. Yet his behavior did not alter. He did not confess to his parents. He did not leave an anonymous tip. He simply waited, maintaining the status quo, banking on the assumption that the police would never violate the sanctity of a good family's home to search a child's bed. This facade of normalcy extended to his interaction with the Clifton family. He was not a stranger to them. He was the neighbor who had played baseball with Maddie. The betrayal was intimate. He stood in his yard, watching the search parties organize, looking Sheila Clifton in the face while possessing the sole knowledge of her daughter's location. This wasn't a crime of distance. It was a crime of intimacy and proximity. The cool as a cucumber label later attributed to him by prosecutors was not an exaggeration. It was a literal observation of a 14-year-old boy who could suppress the natural human reaction to homicide so completely that he fooled the FBI, the police, his parents, and the victim's family for a full week. The breakdown of this deception did not come from a confession or a slip-up in his story, but from the inevitable biology of death. The physical reality of the crime eventually overpowered the psychological walls Joshua had built. The wet spot on the floor, seeping from the base of the waterbed, and the pervasive odor were the silent alarms that eventually drew his mother's attention. But until that moment of discovery, Joshua Phillips stood as a terrifying example of how effectively a human being, even a child, can mask the monstrous behind a veil of suburban mediocrity. He was the boy across the street, the quiet kid, the witness, and the jailer, all wrapped in a terrifyingly calm silence that lasted for 7 agonizing days. The afternoon of the 3rd of November 1998, in the Lakewood neighborhood of Jacksonville, Florida, offered no warning of the fracture that was about to split the community's timeline into a distinct before and after. It was a Tuesday, characterized by the mild, humid autumn typical of the region. The streets were lined with oaks and modest single-story homes, the kind of suburban environment where fences were low and children moved freely between yards. At 8 years old, Maddie Clifton was a fixture of this landscape. With her blonde hair and bright, trusting demeanor, she was known to every neighbor on the block. She had returned home from school, eager to squeeze the last remaining light out of the day. Around 5 p.m., the rhythms of the Clifton household were settling into the early evening routine. Maddie asked her mother, Sheila Clifton, for permission to go outside and play. It was a request that had been granted hundreds of times before. The boundaries were clear, and the neighborhood was considered safe, a place where the proximity of neighbors acted as a collective security system. Sheila agreed but set a strict curfew for dinner. Maddie stepped out the front door, leaving behind the safety of her home for the open air of the yard. She was not wandering aimlessly. She had a specific destination in mind. Across the street lived Joshua Phillips, a 14-year-old boy who was, by all accounts, an unremarkable figure in the neighborhood ecosystem. He was not an outcast, nor was he the center of attention. On this particular afternoon, Joshua was home alone. His parents were still out, leaving him with the unsupervised freedom that teenagers often covet. When Maddie crossed the asphalt that separated their two lives, she was not approaching a stranger. Joshua was a known entity, a playmate of sorts despite the 6-year age gap. The interaction began innocuously. Maddie approached Joshua, and the two began to interact in the front yard before moving the activity indoors. The decision to enter the Phillips residence was the critical threshold. Once the door closed behind them, the visibility that protected the children of Lakewood vanished. Inside the house, the atmosphere shifted from public play to private confinement. According to the accounts later pieced together by investigators and Joshua's own statements, the two engaged in a game of baseball inside the house. It was a reckless choice for an indoor setting, involving a bat and a ball in confined spaces. The game, likely born of boredom, escalated quickly. Joshua took a swing. The bat connected not with the ball, but with Maddie. The impact was severe. The blow struck her in the eye area, causing immediate pain and bleeding. In that split second, the dynamic in the room collapsed. Maddie, injured and terrified, began to cry and scream. For an 8-year-old, this was the natural, biological response to trauma. She wanted her mother. She wanted to go home. For Joshua Phillips, however, the sound of her distress did not trigger a compassionate impulse to seek help. Instead, it triggered a profound, self-preservationist panic. The 14-year-old later claimed his primary fear was not for Maddie's well-being, but for the potential punishment he would face from his father. He was terrified of the consequences of breaking the rules, of causing an injury, of the disruption to his own life. As Maddie's cries grew louder, threatening to penetrate the walls of the house and alert the outside world, Joshua made a decision that defied the developmental logic of a teenager. He decided that the noise had to stop. He dragged the bleeding 8-year-old into his bedroom. The transition from an accidental injury to intentional homicide occurred in the span of moments. The frantic energy of the accident was replaced by a cold, tactical brutality. To silence her, he utilized a telephone cord. He wrapped the ligature around her neck and tightened it, choking off her air and her ability to scream. The strangulation was not a momentary act. It required sustained pressure and a complete disregard for the struggling child beneath him. When the strangulation did not result in immediate death, or perhaps to ensure the finality of the act, Joshua escalated the violence further. He retrieved a knife. The subsequent stabbing was a distinct, deliberate physical effort to end the life of the neighbor he had been playing with only minutes prior. The sequence of events, the blow with the bat, the strangulation, the stabbing transformed the suburban bedroom into a chaotic crime scene, yet it was contained entirely within the four walls of Joshua's personal sanctuary. Maddie Clifton was dead. The silence Joshua had so desperately sought was now absolute. However, the problem of the noise had been replaced by the problem of the body. It was now past 5 p.m. The sun was dipping lower. Parents would be returning home soon. Sheila Clifton would be expecting Maddie for dinner. Joshua was standing in his room with the corpse of an 8-year-old girl, and the clock was ticking against him. His solution for disposal was improvised yet disturbingly effective. Joshua slept on a waterbed, a popular piece of furniture at the time. The mattress sat atop a wooden pedestal frame. The construction of the bed created a cavity beneath the heavy, water-filled bladder, a dark, inaccessible space intended for structural support, not storage. Joshua drained enough water or manipulated the heavy mattress sufficiently to access the wooden platform underneath. He lifted the corner of the waterbed. The physical exertion required to move the dead weight of the victim, combined with the unyielding mass of the water mattress, was significant. He placed Maddie's body inside the pedestal base. To seal the tomb, he lowered the mattress back down. The weight of the water pressed the mattress firmly against the frame, creating an airtight, watertight seal over the body. He then meticulously attended to the environment. He cleaned the blood. He rearranged the room. He restored the superficial order of the household just as the timeline of the afternoon began to run out. Outside, the normalcy of Lakewood was beginning to fracture. It was now approximately 5:30 p.m. Dinner was ready at the Clifton house. Sheila Clifton went to the door to call for her daughter. She called out Maddie's name, expecting the immediate, energetic response that always followed. She waited. There was no answer. She called again, scanning the yards, the street, the familiar spots where Maddie usually played. The silence that returned was heavy and unfamiliar. Sheila walked the perimeter of the property. She checked with the immediate neighbors. The initial concern was mild. Perhaps Maddie had lost track of time. Perhaps she was in a backyard out of earshot. But as the minutes ticked toward 6 p.m., the mother's intuition began to curdle into dread. The sun set and the streetlights flickered on, illuminating empty sidewalks. In 1998, the absence of a child at dinner time was a serious violation of protocol, a deviation that warranted immediate alarm. By the time Joshua Phillips' parents returned home, the crime scene had been sanitized. Joshua was present, appearing calm and composed. He showed no physical signs of the struggle that had just taken place. There was no hysteria, no trembling, no flight response. When the commotion outside began to rise, Joshua did not hide in his room. He walked out the front door to join the developing situation. Sheila Clifton was now frantic. Neighbors were stepping out onto their porches, alerted by the distress in her voice. The police were called, marking the official beginning of the investigation. Patrol cars arrived, their lights cutting through the darkness that had fully settled over the neighborhood. Officers began the standard preliminary questions. When was she last seen? What was she wearing? Who was she with? Joshua Phillips stood among the neighbors, watching the flashing lights. When asked if he had seen Maddie, he answered directly. He admitted she had been there earlier. He told the searchers that yes, she had come over, but she had left. He pointed them away from his house, suggesting she had walked off toward another part of the neighborhood. His demeanor was steady. He did not stutter. He did not look away. He projected the helpful, slightly concerned attitude of a neighbor boy watching a community drama unfold. The search radius expanded instantly. Volunteers began to grab flashlights. They checked storm drains, wooded patches, and unlocked garages. They called Maddie's name in a chorus that echoed through the subdivision. Every minute that passed pushed the likelihood of a simple misunderstanding further away. The police began to tape off the Clifton house, establishing a command post. Inside the Phillips home, life continued with a surreal adherence to routine. Joshua's parents, unaware of the atrocity concealed beneath the plastic and vinyl of their son's bed, went about their evening. Joshua ate dinner. He watched television. He interacted with his family. The proximity of the body mere feet from where he sat did not cause him to crack. The psychological compartmentalization was absolute. As the night wore on, the temperature dropped. The search for Maddie Clifton became a desperate scramble against time. Helicopters were authorized. K-9 units were mobilized. The entire apparatus of law enforcement descended on Lakewood. And in the center of the storm, in the house across the street, the lights eventually went out. Joshua Phillips went to his room. He changed into his nightclothes. He climbed onto his waterbed, the surface shifting liquidly beneath him. Directly underneath him, separated only by the mattress and a wooden board, lay the body of the girl everyone was looking for. He pulled up the covers and, comfortably situated in the heart of the crime scene, he went to sleep. The first night of the deception had been successfully completed. Joshua Phillips remained the eye of the hurricane, a point of stillness around which the chaos of the Lakewood community swirled. To understand the anomaly of his demeanor during that week, one must look backward to the catalyst of the event, to the precise sequence of violence that converted a suburban bedroom into a concealed crime scene. The timeline of the murder itself reveals a rapid, panicked escalation from juvenile play to lethal finality. On the afternoon of November 3, shortly before the sun began to fade, Joshua and Maddie were alone in his house. His parents were absent. The two engaged in a game of indoor baseball, a prohibited activity in the Phillips household. The play was innocent until the physics of the game went wrong. Joshua swung the bat. The ball was struck, but the follow-through or the ball itself narratives vary slightly on the exact mechanics resulted in Maddie being hit. The impact was not lethal, but it was painful. She began to cry. She began to scream. For a 14-year-old boy terrified of his father's strict discipline, the sound of the neighbor girl screaming in his house represented an immediate, catastrophic threat. The fear was not of the law, but of parental retribution. This panic triggered a mechanism in his brain that bypassed empathy and focused entirely on cessation. He needed the noise to stop. He dragged the 8-year-old into his bedroom. The violence that followed was not a singular impulsive blow but a protracted effort to silence a living witness. He first attempted to strangle her with a telephone cord. The ligature was pulled tight, compressing the airways, yet it failed to produce the immediate silence he required. The struggle continued. In a desperate escalation, he retrieved a knife from his Leatherman tool. The switch from the bat to the cord, and finally to the blade, demonstrates a harrowing progression of intent. He stabbed her in the chest. When the violence finally ceased, Maddie Clifton was dead. The cessation of the screaming brought a new, far more permanent problem. There was now a body in the room. The clock was ticking toward the return of his parents. Joshua needed a solution that was immediate and total. He did not look to the backyard or the woods. He looked to the furniture. His bed was a waterbed, a popular fixture of the late 90s, supported by a wooden pedestal base. This was not a frame with open space underneath, but a boxed-in platform constructed of plywood and timber. The mattress itself was a heavy, fluid-filled bladder. To access the interior of the pedestal, the heavy bladder had to be moved or the wooden framing manipulated. Joshua managed to leverage the structure open. He placed Maddie's small body inside the dark, hollow cavity of the pedestal. He did not just place her there. He taped the wooden enclosure back together, sealing the tomb. He then pulled the water-filled mattress back into position, its immense weight pressing down on the plywood lid, effectively sealing the chamber with hundreds of pounds of pressure. When his mother, Melissa Phillips, returned home later that afternoon, the house was quiet. The baseball bat was put away. The knife was cleaned. The room was restored to its typical state of teenage disarray. The barrier between the normal domestic life of the Phillips family and the brutal reality of Maddie Clifton's fate was a single sheet of plywood and a vinyl mattress. As Tuesday turned to Wednesday, the reality of the concealment began to interact with the environment. The search outside was intensifying. Neighbors were taping flyers to telephone poles. Police cruisers were patrolling the streets at walking speed. Inside the room, Joshua maintained a terrifying equilibrium. He slept on that bed. For 7 consecutive nights, he lay inches above the girl he had killed, separated only by the water in the mattress and the wood of the pedestal. This physical proximity suggests a level of dissociation that baffled forensic psychiatrists. He did not flee the room, he inhabited it. By the middle of the week, the biological reality of death began to assert itself. The decomposition process releases gases and fluids. In a closed, unventilated box like the bed pedestal, these byproducts accumulate. A distinct odor began to permeate the small bedroom. It was a sweet, cloying, unmistakable scent that signaled decay. Melissa Phillips noticed the smell. When she asked her son about it, Joshua had a ready explanation. He blamed the family dog. He blamed general teenage hygiene. To mask the rising stench, he began to use incense and strong deodorizers. The room became a battleground of olfactory signals, the chemical masking agents warring with the organic decay. He kept the window open and the air conditioning running, complaining of the heat even as the November air outside turned crisp. The cold room served a dual purpose. It slowed the decomposition slightly and helped vent the odor. The concealment faced another physical threat. The waterbed itself began to leak. Whether damaged during the struggle or the frantic lifting of the mattress, a small puncture had developed in the vinyl. Water began to seep out, pooling on the floor and soaking into the carpet. This introduced a new sensory element: dampness. The room now smelled of mildew, incense, and something else undefined. Joshua's behavior during this week remained consistent with the cool as a cucumber description later given by prosecutors. He did not bar his mother from the room. In fact, Melissa Phillips entered the room multiple times to clean. She vacuumed the floor. She sprayed air freshener. She even scrubbed the carpet where the waterbed had leaked, trying to eliminate the source of the damp smell. She was dismantling the peripheral evidence of the crime without realizing it, her hands inches from the wooden frame that held the body. The psychological compartmentalization required to watch one's mother clean a murder scene was absolute. Joshua sat on the bed, played video games, and did his homework. When volunteers came to the door asking to search the property, Joshua stood by. Police officers entered the home, looked in the closets, and checked under the bed, or at least looked at the base of the bed. They saw a solid wooden pedestal. There was no under to look into without dismantling the furniture. The construction of the bed defeated the casual visual inspection. The assumption was that a child could not hide another child inside a sealed wooden box, nor would a killer sleep atop their victim. By the weekend, the search for Maddie Clifton had reached a fever pitch. The FBI was involved. The community was holding vigils. The pressure on the neighborhood was immense, yet the pressure inside the Phillips home was entirely physical. The smell was becoming impossible to ignore. The incense was no longer sufficient. On Tuesday, November 10, a full week after the murder, the concealment finally failed. It did not fail because of a confession or a police warrant, but because of the relentless physics of the scene. Melissa Phillips was determined to find the source of the odor and the leak. She decided to thoroughly clean Joshua's room while he was at school. She stripped the bedding. She examined the waterbed mattress. She noticed that the leak seemed to be coming from the bottom of the mattress, and the taping on the pedestal looked disturbed. The structure of the bed, which had served as a vault, was now a maintenance problem. She needed to see inside the pedestal to check for water damage or mold, which she assumed was the cause of the terrible smell. Melissa attempted to lift the corner of the heavy water bladder. It was difficult. The water made it unwieldy. She managed to pry up the wooden board that served as the platform. She peered into the dark cavity of the pedestal. Her eyes needed a moment to adjust to the gloom inside the box. She expected to see damp wood, perhaps moldy carpet, or a dead rodent. Instead, she saw clothing. She saw a shape that did not belong in the hollow space of a piece of furniture. As the visual information processed, the horror manifested. She recognized the clothing. It was Maddie Clifton. The body was positioned in the cramping darkness of the pedestal, hidden beneath the very spot where her son had slept for 7 nights. The discovery broke the silence of the house. Melissa Phillips ran from the room, screaming. She fled to a neighbor's house, hysterical, unable to articulate the entirety of what she had seen, only that she had found Maddie. Police arrived almost immediately. The sequence of concealment was over. The officers entered the bedroom, a space that had been searched cursorily before, but this time they dismantled the bed. They confirmed the identity of the victim. The week-long charade of normalcy inside the Phillips home collapsed instantly. When the news broke, the timeline was reconstructed with horrifying clarity. The community realized that, while they were dragging lakes and combing forests, Maddie had been across the street from her own home. The police realized that the polite 14-year-old boy who had watched them search had been guarding a secret literal inches beneath him. The violence of the act, the bat, the cord, the knife, was gruesome, but the concealment was the aspect that haunted the investigators. It required a sustained, conscious effort, taping the wood, managing the smell, lying on the bed. It was not a momentary lapse of reason, but a 1-6-8-hour endurance test of deception. The layout of the room, the specific architecture of the waterbed, and the boy's ability to sever his emotional connection to the reality of the corpse created a scenario that defied the standard profile of a juvenile offender. The bedroom was no longer just a crime scene. It was a testament to a week of impossible coexistence between the living and the dead. The frantic energy that consumed Lakewood following Maddie Clifton's disappearance on the 3rd of November 1998 was fueled by a desperate, collective denial of the statistics. In the majority of child abduction cases, the window for a safe recovery closes within 24 hours, yet the community refused to accept this grim probability. By the morning of November 4, the suburb had transformed into a command center for one of the largest volunteer search efforts in Florida's history. The Clifton home became ground zero, a hub of agonizing activity where Sheila and Steve Clifton waited by the phone, praying for a ransom demand that would never come. Outside their front door, the neighborhood was swarming with law enforcement officers, FBI agents, and hundreds of volunteers. They taped flyers to telephone poles, combed through shrubbery, and knocked on every door within a multi-mile radius. The immense volume of people flooding the streets created a chaotic juxtaposition. A loud, highly visible rescue operation was unfolding just yards away from the silent, invisible crime scene. The search grid was meticulously drawn and redrawn, expanding outward from the Clifton residence. Helicopters equipped with infrared heat-seeking technology scanned the nearby woods and retention ponds, looking for the thermal signature of a lost child. In the midst of this whirlwind, 14-year-old Joshua Phillips appeared to be just another concerned neighbor. He lived directly across the street from the Cliftons. From his front porch, he had a clear view of the police cruisers, the media vans, and the grief-stricken parents of the girl he had killed hours earlier. To the investigators who canvassed the area, Phillips was a potential witness, a polite teenager who might have seen something suspicious. When questioned, he remained calm. He told detectives that he had seen Maddie playing outside earlier that day, but that she had eventually walked off. His demeanor was unremarkable. He showed no signs of panic, no tremors in his voice, and no erratic behavior that would tip off seasoned FBI agents. He was, as later described by those who interacted with him, cool as a cucumber. While the search parties beat back the underbrush in the surrounding forests, Phillips maintained a terrifying routine. He continued to attend school. He ate dinner with his parents. He slept in his room every night. The secret he harbored was not buried in a shallow grave miles away, nor was it hidden in a dumpster. It was contained within the pedestal base of his waterbed. The wooden platform, designed to support the heavy bladder of water, had become a makeshift tomb. For 7 consecutive nights, Phillips climbed onto that mattress, lying mere inches above the decomposing body of the 8-year-old girl the entire state was looking for. The psychological compartmentalization required to sustain this deception was profound. Inside the Phillips home, life proceeded with an eerie normalcy, punctured only by the invasive presence of the search outside. Joshua's room, however, began to change. As the days passed, the reality of death began to assert itself against his efforts at concealment. To mask the inevitable odor of decomposition, Phillips burned incense and used vast amounts of air freshener. When his mother, Melissa Phillips, commented on the smell, he blamed it on the household pets or rotting food, deflecting her suspicion with the sullen defensiveness typical of an adolescent. He kept the air conditioning in his room cranked down to near-freezing temperatures, a physical necessity to retard the decay occurring beneath him. The search outside grew more desperate. By the weekend, the volunteer count had swelled to over 400. They wore yellow ribbons, a symbol of hope that Maddie would return home alive. They formed human chains to sweep large fields, shoulder to shoulder, eyes scanning the ground for a shoe, a piece of clothing, or a shallow depression in the earth. The retention ponds were dragged, and divers felt their way through the murky water, searching for a body they assumed had been dumped by a predator. The prevailing theory was that a stranger had snatched Maddie, a faceless boogeyman who had descended upon Lakewood and vanished. No one looked at the quiet 14-year-old boy across the street who watched the news reports with his parents. Inside the bedroom, the situation was becoming untenable. The waterbed, which Phillips had drained slightly to insert the body, was not a sealed environment. The biology of death was interacting with the mechanics of the furniture. As the search entered its 5th and 6th days, the physical evidence of the crime began to seep out. The smell became overpowering, fighting through the layers of incense and cold air. Phillips attempted to manage the situation, but the laws of nature were working against him. On Tuesday, November 10, exactly 1 week after Maddie Clifton disappeared, the search came to an abrupt, shattering halt. The catalyst was not a detective's breakthrough or a tip from the hotline, but a domestic chore. Melissa Phillips decided to do a deep clean of Joshua's room. The odor had persisted, and she noticed a wet spot on the carpet near the base of the waterbed. Assuming the mattress had sprung a leak, she went to investigate. Joshua was not home. He was at school, sitting in a classroom as if the previous week had been nothing more than a standard routine. Melissa moved the bed to inspect the source of the leak. The structure of the waterbed involved a wooden frame resting on a pedestal. As she examined the base, she saw that the wood had been taped up, a crude attempt to seal something inside. She peeled back the tape. Looking into the dark recess of the pedestal, she saw something that did not belong. At first, in the poor light, it was difficult to identify. She saw a foot. She saw skin that did not look right. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was Maddie. The missing girl was not in the woods or a stranger's van. She was inside the bed Joshua slept on. Melissa Phillips ran from the house, screaming. She collapsed in the yard, her cries alerting a nearby police officer who was part of the ongoing patrol. The officer approached, assuming she was reacting to the stress of the situation or perhaps a medical emergency. When she finally found the breath to speak, she pointed back at her house, uttering the words that would destroy 2 families simultaneously. "She's in there. Maddie's in there." The officer entered the Phillips home, moving toward the bedroom that had been identified. The air inside was thick with the scent of death and chemical deodorizers. He approached the waterbed, lifting the frame to confirm what Melissa had seen. There, concealed within the wooden base, was the body of Maddie Clifton. The discovery was so jarring, so geographically close to the victim's home, that it defied the logic of every search grid established over the past week. The yellow ribbons on the trees outside, the thousands of flyers, the dragged lakes, it had all been a search for a phantom. The reality was much closer and much colder. The news rippled through the law enforcement command post before reaching the public. The police, who had spent 7 days treating the Clifton house as the center of a missing person investigation, now had to secure a murder scene directly across the street. The mood shifted instantly from hopeful anxiety to horrified shock. Officers who had walked past the Phillips house dozens of times, who had perhaps even nodded to Joshua as they started their shifts, were now tasked with taping off his home. Joshua Phillips was arrested at his school later that afternoon. He was taken into custody without incident. There was no high-speed chase, no standoff. When detectives sat him down, the demeanor that had served him so well during the search, the calm, detached, cool, began to crack, but not in the way one might expect. He did not weep for Maddie. He detailed the events with a clinical precision, explaining how the game of baseball had gone wrong, how the panic had set in, and how he had made the decisions that led to her death and concealment. For the community of Lakewood, the discovery brought a complicated grief. The relief of finding Maddie was instantly suffocated by the manner of her discovery. The parents who had volunteered, who had kept their own children close, fearing a roaming predator, were forced to reconcile with the fact that the danger was internal. It was a neighbor, a child, a boy they knew. The 7 days of searching had been an exercise in futility, a desperate attempt to solve a puzzle while the person holding the final piece watched from his window. The stranger danger narrative evaporated, replaced by a more disturbing reality. The search for Maddie Clifton ended not with a rescue, but with the extraction of her body from the room of a boy who had lived among them, played among them, and lied to them with a terrifying proficiency. The yellow ribbons were taken down, not in celebration, but in mourning. The proximity of the killer to the victim, the fact that only a street width separated the grieving parents from their daughter's body, remained the most haunting detail of the entire investigation. The search was over, but the questions regarding how a 14-year-old could maintain such a facade for a full week were only just beginning. Tuesday, the 10th of November 1998, broke with a heavy, suffocating atmosphere over the suburb of Lakewood. For 7 days, the community had existed in a state of suspended animation, oscillating between frantic hope and encroaching dread. The police command center was still active, volunteers were still scouring the woods, and flyers with Maddie Clifton's smiling face were stapled to every telephone pole in the vicinity. Inside the Phillips home, located directly across the street from the Clifton residence, life was attempting to maintain a veneer of normalcy, though the tension of the search permeated the walls. Melissa Phillips, Joshua's mother, had spent the week supporting her neighbors and managing her own household. She had noticed changes in her son's behavior, but nothing that screamed of homicide. He was withdrawn, perhaps, but the entire neighborhood was traumatized. However, a more tangible problem had developed within the sanctuary of Joshua's bedroom. For several days, a strange, unpleasant odor had begun to emanate from his room. It was a thick, organic scent that defied simple explanation. Initially, Melissa attributed it to the typical hygiene of a teenage boy, perhaps dirty laundry, old food, or the family dog having an accident indoors. She had cleaned, sprayed air freshener, and opened windows. But the smell persisted, growing more pungent and cloying with each passing hour. By the morning of November 10, the odor had become unbearable. Joshua was at school, sitting in his 8th grade classes, leaving Melissa alone in the house to confront the source of the stench. She entered his room determined to perform a deep clean. The room was typical for a 14-year-old, cluttered with the artifacts of adolescence, yet the air was heavy. As she moved through the space, she noticed something alarming near the bed, a damp spot on the carpet. Joshua slept on a waterbed, a popular furnishing of the era, which consisted of a fluid-filled mattress resting on a wooden pedestal frame. The structure was solid, designed to support immense weight, and created a hollow cavity underneath the mattress. Seeing the wet patch on the floor, Melissa's immediate concern was a structural failure of the bladder. A leak in a waterbed could cause significant damage to the flooring and the frame itself. The smell, she reasoned, must be stagnant water that had leaked out and soured in the Florida humidity, perhaps soaking into the wood or the carpet padding. She approached the bed to inspect the damage. The frame was constructed of plywood boards, taped and secured to form a box. To find the source of the leak, she needed to look inside the pedestal. She began to dismantle the side of the frame, peeling back the tape and prying at the wood that formed the base. It was a mundane domestic repair, a mother fixing a piece of furniture while her son was at school. The sounds of the search efforts outside the radios, the voices of volunteers drifted in, contrasting sharply with the quiet, focused task inside the bedroom. Melissa managed to loosen a section of the board. She pulled it back, creating an opening large enough to peer into the dark, hollow space beneath the heavy, water-filled mattress. She did not immediately see a leak. Instead, her eyes adjusted to the gloom within the pedestal. There was something there, occupying the space where only dust and darkness should have been. It was not water. It was fabric. She leaned closer. The object was bunched up, wedged into the confinement of the bed base. As the visual information traveled from her optic nerve to her brain, the mundane explanation of a leak evaporated. She recognized the fabric. She saw a pair of socks. They were white socks. And then, the horrific realization struck with the force of a physical blow. They were not just socks. They were attached to feet. The human mind often rejects trauma in the first split second, but the proximity of the search and the omnipresence of Maddie Clifton's disappearance forced the connection instantly. Melissa was looking at a body. The body was small. It was hidden intentionally beneath the very surface where her son had slept for the past 7 nights. The smell was not stagnant water. It was decomposition. Panic did not result in a call to 911 from the kitchen phone. The horror was too immediate, the proximity of the authorities too close. Melissa bolted from the room, the image of the child in the bed frame seared into her vision. She ran out of the house, screaming. The barrier between the secret inside and the investigation outside had shattered. She did not have to wait for police to arrive. They were already there, standing in the street, managing the search grid. She ran directly to an officer, her demeanor hysterical, her words fragmented by shock. She told him she had found something. She told him she had found Maddie. Detective Mike Edwards, a seasoned investigator who had been deeply involved in the search, was among the first to respond to Melissa's screams. The transition from a missing persons search to a homicide recovery happened in seconds. The officers rushed into the Phillips home, guided by a mother whose world had just disintegrated. They entered Joshua's bedroom, the air thick with the scent that Melissa had tried so hard to scrub away. Approaching the waterbed, the investigators looked through the opening Melissa had created. They confirmed what she had seen. Inside the pedestal, wrapped in the darkness of the wooden box, lay the body of Maddie Clifton. She had been shoved into the cramped space, concealed beneath the weight of the water and the sleeping boy. The discovery answered the question that had haunted Lakewood for a week, but the answer was incomprehensible. Maddie had not been abducted by a stranger. She had not wandered off. She had been across the street the entire time, decomposing in the room of her childhood playmate. The police immediately secured the scene. The house was evacuated and taped off. The search for Maddie Clifton was officially over, replaced by the preservation of a crime scene. Melissa Phillips was removed from the home, her status shifting from neighbor to mother of the prime suspect. The shock radiating from the house was palpable. Officers who had spent days hoping to find a lost girl alive now had to process the grim reality of her recovery. The waterbed, once a piece of furniture, was now a coffin. The logistics of the crime scene were complex. The body was hidden inside the frame, meaning the water had to be drained from the mattress before the bed could be fully dismantled, and the remains recovered with dignity and forensic integrity. This process would take hours, requiring careful documentation. Every item in the room, from the bat in the corner to the knife later found, became a piece of evidence. As the police worked inside, the news rippled outward. The discovery of the body in the neighbor's house fundamentally changed the atmosphere of the investigation. It wasn't just that Maddie was dead, it was where she was found. The realization that Joshua Phillips, a 14-year-old boy who had been seen around the neighborhood during the search, was the only person with access to that room, turned the tragedy into a nightmare of betrayal. While Melissa Phillips sat with investigators, struggling to comprehend the dual loss of her neighbor's child and her son's innocence, police were already moving to intercept Joshua at his school. The discovery in the waterbed had closed the search, but it had opened a chapter of legal and psychological horror that the community was entirely unprepared to face. The silence of the house was replaced by the flash of cameras and the precise movements of the forensics team, dismantling the bed to retrieve the girl who had been waiting in the dark for 7 days. Detectives located Joshua Phillips at his school, pulling the 14-year-old out of class just hours after the discovery in his bedroom. He was transported to the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, where the transition from a grieving neighbor to a prime suspect occurred in the stark light of an interrogation room. At first glance, Phillips did not resemble a monster capable of brutal violence. He was a teenager with a quiet demeanor, a boy who had spent the previous week watching cartoons and eating dinner with his family, while a massive manhunt took place just yards from his front door. The interrogation began with the standard protocols, but the gravity of the situation was immediate. Phillips was read his rights, and in the presence of authorities, he began to unravel a narrative that sought to frame the gruesome event as a tragic mistake spiraling out of control. Phillips told investigators that on the afternoon of November 3, he and Maddie Clifton were in his house while his parents were away. According to his initial account, they were playing a game of indoor baseball in the hallway. He claimed he was holding the bat and Maddie was pitching. In this version of events, he swung at a ball and accidentally struck Maddie in the eye with the baseball, causing her to fall and begin screaming in pain. Phillips described a sudden, overwhelming panic. He told the detectives that his father, Steve Phillips, was a strict disciplinarian and that he was terrified of the punishment he would receive for having a girl in the house and injuring her. The fear of his father's reaction, he insisted, was the catalyst for everything that followed. He explained that he dragged the crying girl into his bedroom to silence her. The accident defense hinged on this moment of panic. He claimed he did not intend to kill her initially, but needed her to stop screaming before his parents returned. When his attempts to hush her failed, he strangled her with a telephone cord for approximately 15 minutes. When that did not kill her, and she continued to make noise, he retrieved a Leatherman multi-tool from his pocket. The narrative he presented was one of frantic escalation, a teenager making a series of disastrous choices to cover up a rule violation. However, the forensic evidence gathering in the background began to dismantle the accident theory piece by piece. The crime scene inside the Phillips home told a story of calculated brutality rather than mere panic. Crime scene technicians and the medical examiner, Dr. Bonifacio Floro, cataloged injuries that far exceeded the necessary force to simply silence a child. The autopsy revealed that Maddie Clifton had suffered a barrage of violence that contradicted the idea of a quick, reactive assault. She had been struck with the baseball bat with significant force, causing blunt trauma to her head. The strangulation with the cord was severe, leaving deep ligatures on her neck. Most damning were the stab wounds. The autopsy documented 11 distinct stab wounds and slash marks. Maddie had been stabbed 7 times in the chest and 4 times in the neck. The depth and direction of these wounds indicated a ferocious attack. One of the slashes across her throat was deep enough to sever major structures. The sheer number of wounds undermined the claim that this was a frantic attempt to stop a scream. It evidenced a determination to ensure death. Dr. Floro's analysis suggested that Maddie fought for her life, however briefly, against a much larger and stronger aggressor. The violence was personal, up close, and prolonged. Furthermore, investigators analyzed the timeline and the sequence of actions Phillips described. To retrieve the baseball bat, use the telephone cord, and then open the Leatherman tool required distinct pauses and changes in methodology. Between the strangulation and the stabbing, there was a moment where Phillips had to make a conscious decision to switch weapons. The telephone cord had snapped during the strangulation, prompting him to switch to the knife. This transition marked the legal and logical shift from a panicked reaction to premeditated murder. The choice to escalate the violence rather than seek help, especially when the initial injury, the baseball strike, was non-lethal, stripped away the defense of accidental death. The concealment of the body further eroded the image of a scared child making a mistake. Phillips detailed how he emptied the pedestal of his waterbed, a specific model with a hollow base meant for storage. He pushed Maddie's body inside, then meticulously taped the base back up to seal the smell and the evidence away. He cleaned the blood from the floor and the carpet. For 7 nights, he slept on the mattress filled with water, separated from his victim by only a thick layer of vinyl and wood. This behavior demonstrated a level of compartmentalization that disturbed investigators. A panicked child might run away or confess immediately. A cold-blooded killer hides the body and continues life as normal. During the interrogation, detectives pressed him on his behavior during the search. They pointed out that he had watched police dogs scour his yard. He had seen volunteers walking arm in arm through the neighborhood. He had looked Maddie's parents in the eye. Throughout the week, Phillips had maintained a facade of total normalcy, described by some law enforcement officials as being cool as a cucumber. This emotional flatline was inconsistent with a boy consumed by guilt or fear over a tragic accident. The psychological profile emerging was one of detachment. The forensic analysis of the clothing and the room corroborated the intentionality. There was no evidence of a baseball game gone wrong in the hallway that could justify the subsequent slaughter in the bedroom. The blood evidence was concentrated in the bedroom, consistent with the assault occurring there. The disparity between the motive fear of a father's yelling and the action brutal overkill was too vast for the jury or the prosecutors to accept. The prosecution argued that the accident was a fabrication or, at best, a trigger for a latent violent impulse. Phillips eventually signed a written confession detailing the acts, but the physical evidence spoke louder than his words. The combination of blunt force trauma, strangulation, and multiple stab wounds created a trifecta of causes of death, any of which showed intent to kill. The medical examiner's report concluded that Maddie was alive during the infliction of most of these injuries, suffering immensely before she finally succumbed. The legal team for the state recognized that the accident defense was untenable against the graphic reality of the autopsy photos. The intent to kill was written on the victim's body. The interrogation concluded with Phillips being charged with first-degree murder, the detective satisfied that the boy sitting across from them was not a victim of circumstance, but a predator who had killed to protect himself from the consequences of a minor infraction. The forensic narrative had successfully closed the gap between a missing child case and a capital murder investigation. The trial of Joshua Earl Patrick Phillips commenced on the 6th of July 1999, in a courtroom charged with the palpable grief of the Jacksonville community. Despite being only 14 years old at the time of the crime, Phillips faced the legal system as an adult. Under Florida law, a grand jury indictment for first-degree murder mandated that the juvenile be moved to adult court, stripping him of the protections usually afforded to minors. The proceedings were presided over by Circuit Judge Charles Arnold, who managed a courtroom packed with media, the devastated family of Maddie Clifton, and a public desperate to understand how a quiet teenager could commit such an atrocity. State Attorney Harry Shorstein led the prosecution, determined to prove that the death of Maddie Clifton was no tragic accident born of panic, but a brutal, conscious act of self-preservation. The defense, led by attorney Richard Nichols, faced an uphill battle. They did not contest that Phillips had killed Maddie. Instead, their strategy hinged on the question of intent. Nichols argued that the initial blow with the baseball bat was indeed accidental, a playful moment gone wrong, and that the subsequent actions, the stabbing and strangulation, were the frantic, irrational responses of an immature 14-year-old boy terrified of his father's strict discipline. The defense painted a portrait of a child whose judgment collapsed under pressure, hoping to secure a conviction on a lesser charge of second-degree murder, which would spare Phillips a mandatory life sentence. The prosecution dismantled this narrative by focusing on the sequence of injuries and the defendant's behavior in the aftermath. Shorstein argued that even if the first blow from the baseball bat was unintentional, the decision to drag the bleeding girl into the bedroom wrap a telephone cord around her neck, and retrieve a knife from a Leatherman tool demonstrated a clear, cold calculation. The sheer duration of the assault, which the medical examiner indicated could have lasted up to 15 minutes, provided ample time for reflection. Phillips had multiple opportunities to stop, to call for help, or to simply walk away. Instead, he chose to escalate the violence until Maddie was dead. One of the most harrowing moments of the trial came when the jury was presented with the details of Phillips's conduct during the 7 days Maddie lay beneath his bed. Witnesses testified to his calm demeanor, noting that he appeared cool as a cucumber while hundreds of volunteers scoured the neighborhood. He attended school, ate meals with his family, and slept in the very bed that concealed his neighbor's decomposing body. The prosecution utilized this behavior to demonstrate a depravity inconsistent with the defense's panicked child theory. They argued that a child in a state of pure panic would eventually crack, confess, or show signs of immense distress. Phillips, however, had maintained the ruse with chilling efficiency, even participating in the search efforts to deflect suspicion. Melissa Phillips, the defendant's mother, provided emotional testimony that underscored the tragedy destroying 2 families. She recounted the moment she discovered the body, a detail that had by then become infamous. But her presence on the stand served a different purpose during the trial. It highlighted the domestic environment Phillips lived in, which the defense tried to leverage to explain his fear of his father, Steve Phillips. While testimony suggested Steve was a strict disciplinarian who did not tolerate errors, the prosecution maintained that fear of being grounded or yelled at was not a sufficient driver for a violent murder unless there was an underlying malice. The closing arguments brought the dichotomy of the case into sharp focus. Nichols implored the jury to see Phillips as the child he was, a boy who made a catastrophic mistake and then compounded it through immaturity. Shorstein, conversely, asked the jurors to look at the evidence of the wounds and the week-long deception. He reminded them that Maddie Clifton did not die from a baseball bat. She died because Joshua Phillips decided she could not be allowed to leave his room alive. The prosecutor emphasized that the accident defense ended the moment Phillips tightened the cord around her neck. On the 8th of July 1999, after just over 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. They found Joshua Phillips guilty of first-degree murder. The speed of the decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the physical evidence and the implausibility of the defense's claims regarding lack of intent. In Florida, a conviction for first-degree murder carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no discretion allowed for the judge, regardless of the defendant's age. During the formal sentencing hearing held later in August, Judge Charles Arnold addressed Phillips directly. The judge described the crime as one of the most senseless and brutal acts he had witnessed in his career. He noted that Phillips had effectively consumed a human life and threw away his own. The sentence was pronounced, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Phillips showed little emotion as his fate was sealed, maintaining the same detached effect that had characterized his behavior throughout the investigation and trial. For years, this sentence stood as the final word on the case. However, the legal landscape regarding juvenile offenders shifted dramatically in 2012 with the United States Supreme Court ruling in Miller v. Alabama. The court held that mandatory life sentences without parole for those under the age of 18 at the time of their crimes violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. This ruling did not guarantee freedom, but mandated that judges must have the discretion to consider the defendant's youth and potential for rehabilitation before imposing such a severe penalty. As a result of this ruling, Joshua Phillips became eligible for a resentencing hearing. The proceedings began in 2017, nearly 2 decades after Maddie Clifton's murder. The reopening of the case forced the Clifton family to relive the trauma of 1998. Maddie's parents and sister appeared in court once again to deliver victim impact statements, describing the permanent void left in their lives and their enduring fear that the man who killed Maddie might one day walk free. During the resentencing, the defense presented evidence suggesting that Phillips had been a model prisoner. He had obtained his GED, completed various educational courses, and had not received a single disciplinary infraction during his incarceration. They argued that this demonstrated his rehabilitation and proved that he was not incorrigible, the legal standard required to uphold a life without parole sentence for a juvenile. They urged the court to grant him a term of years that would eventually allow for his release. The state, however, remained steadfast. They argued that the heinous nature of the crime outweighed his behavior in prison. They called forensic psychologists and revisited the details of the murder to argue that the depravity shown by Phillips at age 14 indicated a permanent character defect that could not be cured. The prosecution emphasized that while Phillips had matured chronologically, the act of slaughtering an 8-year-old neighbor and sleeping over her body for a week revealed a level of dangerousness that society should not be asked to risk again. In November 2017, Circuit Judge Waddell Wallace handed down his decision. After reviewing the entirety of the evidence, the new psychological evaluations, and the principles set forth by the Supreme Court, Judge Wallace reinstated the sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. He concluded that the murder of Maddie Clifton fell into the category of rare and uncommon cases, where the crime reflects irreparable corruption rather than transient immaturity. The judge noted that despite Phillips's good behavior in prison, the sheer brutality of the act and the elaborate concealment warranted the maximum penalty available under the law. An appeals court later upheld this decision in 2020. While the legal battles technically offered avenues for review, the judicial system repeatedly affirmed that the justice demanded by the death of Maddie Clifton required Joshua Phillips to remain incarcerated for the remainder of his natural life. The verdict served as a somber conclusion to a case that had shattered the innocence of a community, affirming that some actions, regardless of the age of the perpetrator, bear consequences that time cannot erode.